This video is sponsored by Braid Shadow Legends, the hot new mobile game where you tap a button over and over. And also by NordVPNNN, 3 times the N for 3 times the browsing safety. And it's also sponsored by Shill Scare, the #1 site for scaring off people who are relentlessly trying to sell you their crap. Okay, that's a joke, obviously. I currently have, let me check, 82 subscribers, which probably isn't quite enough to tempt any potential corporate sponsors. But hey, like and subscribe, and then maybe someday I'll actually be able to start my videos with genuine paid promotional bullshit. Which, now I think of it, is probably not a good thing for anyone actually watching these videos, and therefore isn't likely to encourage anyone to like and subscribe. But please like and subscribe anyway. I promise to think about maybe trying to avoid turning into a soulless corporate shill, unless the money's good, or moderate, or bad. Well, let's say I definitely won't do it if there's no money involved. Unless there's some good free stuff. Or some mediocre free stuff. You know what, let's just forget about that. There's a word that used to have vital significance when talking about games, but isn't used so much these days. It's still around, sure, but it doesn't carry quite the weight it once did. That word is playability. Back when I was a youngster and gaming magazines were a thing, publications like Mean Machine Sega, my personal favourite, gave games a separate score for things like graphics and sound, and also for playability, and it was almost always that category which gamers of the day considered to be most important. Graphics and sound were important too, sure, but did the game control well? That was our first question. Well, usually. Then, as now, there existed a segment of the gaming world that considered graphics to be the most important element. Anyway, these days people aren't so interested in playability or the responsiveness and immediacy of the controls, and that's not because these things are any less important, any gamer knows that they are. It's because they're kind of taken for granted. Nowadays the focus is more on gameplay mechanics rather than the question of whether a game has mastered the art of walking from side to side when you press a button. Unless a game has particularly terrible controls or particularly good, playability doesn't really need to be discussed. It wasn't always that way. Back when technology was more limited and less standardized, before programming techniques had evolved, before the advent of versatile game engines that came with most of what you needed to make a game built in, you never really knew what you were going to get. Would the main character of that new platformer control like a lump of lead with 2 broken legs, or like a bolt of lightning on a frozen lake that had recently been the site of an oil spill? Games that got the balance right tend to be the ones we remember, but they were in the minority. The Mega Drive was home to many platformers, probably too many. Some of them were great, a lot of them were not. Playability wasn't the sole defining difference between the great and the awful, but it was probably the most important, ahead even of the overall design and structure of the game. A humdrum game could be well worth your time if it was just fun to control, and a game that was otherwise well designed could be painful if it controlled like a... well, I've already overdone my analogies, but you know what I mean. I've said before that in terms of overall design and quality, Sonic the Hedgehog on the Mega Drive was never quite the equal of his bitter rival Mario. But man, was it fun to control. I'm not saying that it was poorly designed, in fact it was perfectly designed in terms of what it was trying to do, but Mario games always did a bit more. But of all platform games of the 16-bit era, Sonic may be the one that most exemplifies the concept of playability. Sonic was fast, which is probably the one thing everyone knows about Sonic, and he was manoeuvrable. He could turn on a dime, or even an Australian 5-cent piece, which is actually smaller for my international audience, if I have one, which I don't. I don't even have a national one. Anyway, when you told him to jump, Sonic didn't have time to ask how high, because he was already airborne. But, well, once the 16-bit era ended, it would be fair to say that Sonic had some trouble adapting to the 3D world. Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 had their upsides, sure, but the games lacked the elegance, polish, and easy accessibility of their Mega Drive predecessors. And soon things began really going downhill. And not downhill in the good way, like Sonic on a pair of skis or being chased by a truck. Then, in 2010, Sonic the Hedgehog 4 was released. This was the first numbered title in the series since Sonic 3 in 1994, and it was heralded as the return to the series' 2D roots. I was quite excited. I'd avoided the worst reviewed 3D Sonic games, and I'd quite enjoyed Sonic Adventure, but to my mind that didn't really come close to capturing the magic of old school Sonic. But now, I thought, with the addition of time, wisdom and technical know-how, Maybe the time was right for a return to 2D. So I bought a copy on the PlayStation Network, downloaded it, started playing it. And in disgust, I stopped playing it about 10 minutes later. I was baffled. I couldn't reconcile what I'd just experienced with my internal concept of Sonic the Hedgehog. It looked like Sonic, kind of, but it sure as hell didn't play like it. This Sonic was not maneuverable, he couldn't turn on a dime, or even on $1 million coin, which I have to imagine is pretty large, like maybe a couple of football fields. And he was not fast. Well, he had the potential to be fast, but he needed a lot of time to build up a head of steam. Worst of all, while it was an effort to make him go fast, it was really easy to get him to stand still. If you took your finger off the directional pad at any time, he just stopped, with no real sense of momentum at all. And that was true even if he was mid-air or running down a steep slope. Basically, this new game seemed to be the antithesis of a Sonic game, regardless of its title, so I turned off my PS3 and never touched the game again. Until now. I've had the Steam version sitting in my library for a while now. I don't actually remember buying it. I think I may have got it in a Humble Bundle or something. I certainly wouldn't have paid much money for it. In any case, after looking at the updated Wonder Boy 3 for my last video, I figured it might be time to revisit another revamped old school platformer and see if it merited more than 10 minutes of playtime. Okay, first off, is it just me or is there something a little off about the way Sonic is wagging his finger here? I think it might just be because it's got more than 2 frames of animation unlike the first Sonic game, but it just looks weird to me. And once you get into the game, again there's something almost discomforting about this Sonic. I mean, it's definitely him, but this 3D model also seems a little off to me. His head's a little too large, his limbs are a little too gangly. Still, it's nowhere near as bad as the first version of the upcoming movie Sonic. And then there's the animation. When you press the directional button to move, at first Sonic just sort of strolls along for a bit. He doesn't exert himself, he doesn't put any effort into it, and he just walks with a contemptuous lack of urgency. It's as if he resents the player for asking him to move at all and is unwilling to commit himself to the task until he's sure we really mean it. But even worse is the stuff you can't see. The movement is as sluggish and unresponsive as I remembered. The key really is the momentum, or the lack thereof. So yes, it's basically as bad as I expected. I'm tempted to just leave it there, but I guess I've got a video to make, so let's keep going. Maybe there are some redeeming features to be found? Well, this first zone is a not entirely terrible rehash of the classic Green Hill motif. I'm not a huge fan of the way everything seems kind of shiny, and the backgrounds aren't exactly super high quality, but yeah, it works well enough. And I have to say that the levels contain all the elements you'd expect from the first zone of a 2D Sonic game, and they're assembled with a degree of care and skill. Steep hills flow into loops and twists, which lead to springs that launch you into highlands with floating platforms, which in turn lead fluently onto more hills, loops, twists and springs. It's not exactly groundbreaking level design, but it's competent to say the least. It's a shame then that the controls make it almost impossible to appreciate the nicely flowing levels. It is possible to build up some speed, and even keep it up for a little while, but then you'll hit a slope at slightly the wrong angle, or jump at an inopportune time, or even just take your finger off the directional pad for a microsecond, and any speed will be lost. And sure, 16-bit Sonic games punished you for mistakes by bringing you to a grinding halt, but you always knew why it happened, whether you hit an enemy or some spikes or just a wall or whatever. In Sonic 4 though, your speed seems like a fragile thing, easily lost and then a chore to get back again. I know I'm banging on a fair bit about the playability or otherwise of this game, but it really is the most important thing about it. Everything that might have been good is negated by the fact it's nigh on impossible to enjoy actually playing the game, and everything bad is exacerbated by the handling issues. The first boss is a direct callback to Sonic's very first encounter with Dr. Robotnik, or Eggman, or whatever they're calling him these days. In fact, the fight is almost identical, except that this version of the boss gets slightly more proactive with his ball swinging towards the end, which doesn't make much difference really, the fight is still incredibly easy. Anyway, on to the next zone. Actually, before that, I might as well mention these special stages. Like the very first Sonic game, you access them by reaching the end of the level with more than 50 rings and then jumping through the big golden ring. And you better know when the end of the level is coming, because if you run right past the ring, good luck turning around in time to get back to it before the level ends. Also, like the very first Sonic game, the special stage is a rotating maze of gems stacked full of rings and bumpers to bounce you around. And actually, I think this is a good step up from the original special stages. For one thing, you control the rotation here rather than Sonic himself, which actually gives you a greater sense of control. I'm not saying these are the best special stages in any 2D Sonic game, not by a long shot, but they're fine. Okay, next zone. This one is a rehash of the classic Casino Night zone, and I have to say it's actually a pretty good adaptation. The first act contains the traditional slot machine, but the second act features cards as its main theme. Run past them and you get a poker-style payout based on whatever comes up. I don't know if I was just really lucky, but they seem to hand out extra lives with wild abandon. I wish I had such luck with cards in real life, and maybe I wouldn't have been kneecapped by that gangster back in '76. There are other nifty features, like the cannons you can aim to shoot yourself at the right angle, and the decks of cards that whisk you through the level. It's nothing truly remarkable, in fact it's nothing that hasn't been seen in a Sonic game before, but these sorts of things are nice touches and are very much in keeping with the whole Sonic style. And like the first zone, the levels are well structured and obviously designed and laid out with some care. So, I say again, it's a shame the handling strips most of the fun out of it. This boss too is very much an adaptation of a boss from the very first Sonic game, with only a few modern touches. It's not that interesting and not that challenging. Hey ho, on to the next zone. This one is called the Lost Labyrinth Zone, and if you're familiar with the first Sonic game, you probably know what to expect. You might also approach this zone with some trepidation, as its old school counterpart was notorious for causing kids untold angst as Sonic scrambled around underwater, desperately searching for a source of oxygen. The music that played as he neared death may have scarred an entire generation, and will induce anxiety to this day. That's not much of a concern in this first act though. The only noteworthy thing here is a giant sphere that you have to balance on top of as it moves along rails. Almost a cool idea, I guess. The second act does something that nearly counts as genuinely cool, at least by this game's standards. It's dark in here, but you're given a torch, which you can use to light lamps, and also set off dynamite. Oh, and there are minecarts. A cliche perhaps, but a welcome enough addition. There's actually a good bit of atmosphere in this level. The third act is the one that's going to trigger all those traumatic memories of Sonic gasping his last gasp as the water fills his lungs. I was never a fan of underwater segments in Sonic games, not so much because of the stress of avoiding drowning, but because of the reduced movement speed. And I'm not a fan of it here either, but actually, thanks to the fact that the controls are so sluggish in general, the way the action slows down underwater is less noticeable and less irritating. Still not my idea of a fun game mechanic though. The boss has some issues too. You have to go through a rising water section, and if you don't do it with appropriate haste, it's definitely possible to drown here. Then, once you reach the boss, you face the prospect of instant death by being crushed between the pillars. It's not too tough to avoid them, but this game has a weird habit of really flinging you away with force whenever you damage a boss, and the uncanny knack of throwing you directly into harm's way when it does so. It gets kind of frustrating, but it's not super difficult. Okay, on to the final zone. This one seems to have the most in common with Sonic 2's Metropolis zone, except the music. God damn, that was some excellent music in the original zone. And since I've found my way to that topic, let me pause a moment to talk about the music in Sonic 4. It's okay, I think. I honestly can't remember any of it now I'm sitting here typing this. But pretty much every track from the 16-bit Sonics is still fresh in my memory. And that should tell you everything you need to know about the music in Sonic 4 and how far short of the original it falls. Anyway, this final zone. Again, it's surprisingly decent. It gets marked down a bit though on account of the instant kill crushing traps. It's just too easy to find yourself underneath one before you even realise what it is, largely because they're not really visually distinctive. They blend into the foreground a bit. The third act has a forced scrolling section where you're being chased by a giant drilling machine, and I kind of have mixed feelings about these levels in Sonic games. They add a bit of challenge and a bit of variety, but it always feels a bit cheap when you die to them, and that feeling is exacerbated by the fact the controls seem to be working against you more often than not. Speaking of which, the boss. Dear God, this is annoying. It's reminiscent of the original Metropolis boss from Sonic 2 with a whole heap of added irritation. I'm having the same problem I had with the last boss, where you just seem to get flung back into harm's way whenever you actually manage to do any damage. The first phase isn't too much of an issue, but the second phase, where you have to chase after him, is a nightmare. Because you're always moving forward, it's almost impossible to grab any rings after being hit as they fall behind you. And even though you're ostensibly moving at full speed, the fact you can only gradually inch forward towards the boss means it actually feels like you're trapped in molasses. It really is driving me nuts. In fact, I'm sorry to say it, but this is where my journey with this game ends. There's not much left, just the final boss really, but I'm not going to see it and I really don't feel like I'm missing out on much. I've only got one life to live, and I'm not going to spend any more time with Sonic 4. The experience of playing it is just too painful. And that really is a shame, because there's genuinely a lot of potential here, in terms of the level design at least. If the controls even came close to resembling a 16-bit Sonic game, this would be a worthy if unremarkable addition to the canon. Instead, it's just a rich heaping of disappointment. But there's a shocking twist in the tale. Well, probably not that shocking, given it's basically in the title of the video. Turns out, despite my best intentions, I am actually going to be spending more time with Sonic 4. You see, it's an episodic game, and this is just the first episode. The second episode was released a couple of years after this one, and I figure I should probably give it a go. So it turns out that this video is episodic as well, as next time I'll be looking at Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 2. Until then, get off my lawn.